In the autumn of 1889, down the same aisle in a small church hidden deep in the West Virginia mountains, walked two brides on the very same day. One was 17 years old. The other was her own mother. Into the same bloodline they were both marrying, a bloodline that had been circling back on itself for 4 generations. What would become one of the most disturbing tales of forced inbreeding ever whispered about in the isolated hollows of Appalachia is what happened next. So twisted is this story that even today, the family's name is refused to be spoken aloud by locals. Hello everyone. Before we begin, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. This way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The year was 1889, and the Blackwood family, deep in the remote mountains of West Virginia, had been keeping it in the family for nearly a century. From simple geographic isolation, something far more sinister had evolved. A deliberate program of intermarriage, it was, that would produce children so physically and mentally damaged that when the Blackwood name was mentioned, neighboring valleys would cross themselves. But this story isn't just about one family's descent into genetic horror. It's about how an entire mountain community became trapped in a cycle of inbreeding so severe that by the 1880s, telling who was related to whom was impossible. It's about how young women like Moriel Blackwood were treated as breeding stock. Their futures were decided by patriarchs who viewed them as nothing more than vessels to keep their pure mountain blood from mixing with outsiders. Discovered in 1987 when a forgotten cemetery was unearthed during a mining operation were the records I'm about to share with you. Headstones, family Bibles, and diary entries that revealed a truth so psychotically devastating that the West Virginia Historical Society initially refused to make them public were hidden beneath decades of overgrowth. The complete, unfiltered story of America's most isolated inbred community is what you're about to hear, and why one teenage girl was forced to watch her own mother become her sister-in-law in a ceremony that violated every natural law. In 1798, the Blackwood family's descent into genetic nightmare began when Jeremiah Blackwood led his wife and 6 children into the most remote valley in what would later become West Virginia. From debt or the law, Jeremiah wasn't running. He was running from what he called the corruption of mixing blood. His Scottish Highland ancestry, he believed, made his family superior to the mongrel Americans settling the frontier, and he was determined to keep his bloodline pure. For the first generation, almost romantic seemed this isolation. In a valley so remote that it took 3 days of hard travel to reach the nearest settlement, the Blackwoods built their homestead. Completely self-sufficient they were, growing their own food, making their own clothes, and following their own twisted interpretation of biblical law that Jeremiah had crafted to justify what he planned to do to his descendants. When Jeremiah's children came of age, a decision that would damn 4 generations of Blackwoods was made by him. Rather than allow them to marry outside the family, he arranged marriages between his own sons and daughters. His sister Rebecca was married by his eldest son Thomas. Their sister Sarah was married by his second son William. To their cousin who had joined them in the valley, the youngest daughter Mary was given. By claiming they were preserving God's chosen bloodline and preventing the family from being polluted by outsiders, Jeremiah justified these unions. Immediate and horrifying were the results. Only half survived to adulthood of the first generation of inbred children. Signs of what we now know to be severe genetic disorders were shown by those who did survive. Cleft palates, missing limbs, profound mental disabilities, and a condition that caused their skin to take on a grayish-blue tint. But as warning signs, rather than recognizing these deformities, Jeremiah interpreted them as proof that his family was marked by God and different from ordinary humans. By 1850, a community of barely 50 people had been created by 3 generations of systematic inbreeding, all related to each other in multiple ways. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and cousins married cousins with such frequency that the family tree looked more like a spiderweb. So severely disabled were the children born from these unions that many couldn't speak, couldn't walk, and died before reaching their 5th birthday. Yet between blood relatives, the surviving patriarchs continued to arrange marriages, convinced that they were preserving something sacred rather than creating something monstrous. By 1870, what began as religious isolation had been transformed by the Blackwood elders into something that can only be described as a human breeding program. Led by Jeremiah's grandson, Ezekiel Blackwood, a systematic approach to marriage had been developed by the family that treated women like livestock and children like crops to be harvested. Detailed records of every birth, death, and union in the community were kept by Ezekiel. The cold calculation behind each marriage arrangement was revealed by these records, discovered in his personal Bible. With the precision of a livestock breeder, he tracked bloodlines, noting which combinations produced the strongest children and which resulted in early death or severe deformity. But deeply disturbed was his definition of strongest. Children who showed signs of what he called the Blackwood mark, the blue-tinged skin that had become common in the family, were valued by him. No say in these arrangements did the women in the community have. Based entirely on Ezekiel's breeding calculations, girls as young as 13 were assigned husbands. At 14, Mary Ellen Blackwood's mother, Catherine, had been forced into her first marriage to her own uncle, a man 30 years her senior, who had already fathered 6 deformed children with his previous wife, who was also his niece. When that husband died, to another male relative, Catherine was immediately reassigned, as if she were property being transferred from one owner to another. In the diary of Rebecca Blackwood, Catherine's sister, who managed to hide her writings in a hollow tree for over 50 years, the psychological trauma this system created was documented. A community of women living in constant terror is revealed by her entries, never knowing when they would be forced into another incestuous union, or when their children would be taken away and given to other family members to raise. She wrote about women who tried to escape the valley only to be tracked down and brought back by the men who justified their actions by claiming that Blackwood blood belongs to the family. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Ezekiel's practice of doubling down on successful breeding pairs. When a brother-sister marriage produced children who survived to adulthood, he would arrange for those children to marry each other, creating an even tighter genetic spiral. By 1885, the product of 6 different types of familial relationships simultaneously were some children in the community. The children of siblings, the grandchildren of cousins, and the great-grandchildren of uncle-niece pairs. So severe was the genetic damage that newborn mortality reached nearly 70%. Yet, as proof that his system was working, Ezekiel interpreted the survival of any child. In the spring of 1889, news that would shatter what little innocence remained in her already traumatic life was received by 17-year-old Mary Ellen Blackwood. That both she and her 34-year-old mother, Catherine, would be married on the same day to the same branch of the family tree had been decided by Ezekiel. Her cousin Samuel was to be married by Mary Ellen, while the second wife of Samuel's father, Isaiah, would become Catherine, a man who was simultaneously Catherine's brother-in-law, second cousin, and the father of her daughter's new husband. The psychological horror of learning that her mother would become her sister-in-law while she became her mother's stepdaughter-in-law is captured in Mary Ellen's diary, written in secret and hidden beneath loose floorboards in her cabin. So tangled were the family relationships that even the participants couldn't fully understand how they were related. "I cannot call him father when he is to be my husband's father and my mother's husband," Mary Ellen wrote. "I cannot call her mother when she is to be my husband's stepmother. We are all becoming each other, and I fear I am losing my mind." The depths of the community's dysfunction were revealed by the preparation for this double wedding. From what we would now recognize as severe depression and trauma, Catherine, who had already buried 8 children from her previous forced marriages, was suffering. Months earlier she had stopped speaking and spent most of her days staring at the graves of her deceased children. Yet as feminine obedience, Ezekiel viewed her silence and praised her as an example for other women in the community. Meanwhile, a way to escape the valley before the wedding ceremony was desperately being tried to be found by Mary Ellen. She had heard whispers from traders who occasionally passed through that there was a world beyond the mountains where people married strangers and had healthy children, and twice she attempted to run away. But both times by her male relatives, she was caught and brought back. After the second attempt, in her cabin she was locked and guarded around the clock. Impossible to ignore was becoming the physical and mental toll of generations of inbreeding. The product of a brother-sister union was Samuel, Mary Ellen's intended husband, and he suffered from severe mental disabilities. Of a child was his mental capacity, he couldn't read or write, and frequently he had violent outbursts that terrified even his own family. 17 children with his previous wives, all of whom were his relatives, had been fathered by Isaiah, who was to marry Catherine, and only 3 had survived to adulthood. Yet as proven breeders and suitable husbands for the women in his genetic experiment, Ezekiel saw these men. If you're still watching, braver than most you already are. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Grey and cold, October 13, 1889, dawned in the Blackwood Valley. With wilted wild flowers and flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on the walls, the makeshift church, little more than a wooden cabin with rough-hewn pews, was decorated. What Ezekiel called a blessed double union that will strengthen our holy bloodline was gathered by the entire community of 37 surviving Blackwoods to witness. A young woman on the edge of complete psychological collapse is revealed in Mary Ellen's diary entry from that morning. "I dressed in grandmother's yellowed wedding dress," she wrote, "the same dress mother wore when she was first given to Uncle Marcus and his mother wore when she married her own brother. The ghosts of all our cursed unions are carried by the dress. I can smell death in its fabric." A grotesque parody of a normal wedding was the ceremony itself. Over both ceremonies simultaneously, Ezekiel presided, reading from a corrupted version of Christian vows that he had rewritten to emphasize the sacred duty of preserving pure blood. Beside her daughter at the altar, Catherine stood, both women wearing identical dresses, both being given away by the same man, Ezekiel, to father and son. In a letter written by a traveling preacher who happened upon the ceremony and was forced to witness it, the psychological horror of the moment was captured. He described Mary Ellen as a girl who looked as though she were attending her own funeral, while Catherine stood like a woman already dead, her eyes seeing nothing, her hands shaking as though she carried an invisible weight. So severely deformed were several of the wedding guests, the preacher noted, that he initially mistook them for creatures from a fever dream. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization, documented in multiple family records, that for the Blackwood community, this double wedding was not unusual. At least 6 other instances of mothers and daughters being married on the same day to related men had occurred over the previous 30 years. As efficient ways to consolidate bloodlines and ensure that families remained tightly bound together, Ezekiel viewed these simultaneous ceremonies. One final desperate attempt to escape her fate was made by Mary Ellen as the vows were exchanged. According to her diary, she announced to the gathered crowd that she was already pregnant, a lie designed to delay or cancel the wedding. But horrifically, her deception backfired. As proof that she had been blessed by God, Ezekiel interpreted her announcement and declared that the wedding must proceed immediately to sanctify the holy child growing within her. To Samuel she was married while the community believed she carried his child, adding another layer of psychological trauma to an already unbearable situation. Consequences that even Ezekiel couldn't have anticipated were brought by the months following the double wedding. Living in the same household as her mother, who was now also her sister-in-law, what can only be described as a complete mental breakdown began to be experienced by Mary Ellen. Barely legible are her diary entries from this period, filled with repeated phrases like, "I am my own aunt," and mother calls him husband, but he is my father, husband's father. So twisted had the family dynamics become that normal conversation was impossible. As both her father-in-law and her stepfather, Mary Ellen had to address Isaiah at dinner. Simultaneously, Mary Ellen's mother and sister-in-law was Catherine, while also being the stepmother to her own daughter's husband. So severe was the psychological confusion that several family members stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through gestures and nods. But yet to come was the real horror. At the same time, in the spring of 1890, both women became pregnant, Mary Ellen carrying Samuel's child, while Catherine carried Isaiah's. As proof of God's blessing on their double marriage, these pregnancies were celebrated by the community, but a different story is told by medical records hidden in Ezekiel's Bible. Due to the extreme genetic damage in their bloodlines, both women suffered severe complications during pregnancy, likely with what the family called the Blackwood curse. Mary Ellen's child was born, severe physical deformities that made survival impossible. For only 3 days the baby lived, during which time Mary Ellen refused to hold or name the child. Even more tragically ended Catherine's pregnancy when she died during childbirth along with her infant son. Not as consequences of inbreeding, but as God's way of calling the chosen ones home, these deaths were interpreted by the community. Into a catatonic state that lasted for months was sent Mary Ellen by the loss of Catherine. Several times she was found attempting to dig up her mother's grave with her bare hands, muttering about how she needed to separate the relationships and untangle the bloodlines. That Mary Ellen had been touched by the devil began to be whispered by the surviving members of the community, not understanding that what we now recognize as severe psychological trauma and grief was being experienced by her. To fewer than 20 surviving members had the Blackwood community dwindled by 1891. Most of the fourth generation of inbred children had been claimed by disease, genetic disorders, and psychological breakdowns. Yet between the survivors, Ezekiel continued to arrange marriages, convinced that each new union brought them closer to achieving genetic perfection. Under constant supervision, he began keeping Mary Ellen, planning to arrange her next marriage as soon as her period of mourning ended. Not through outside intervention, but through the complete collapse of their genetic experiment came the end of the Blackwood dynasty. What can only be described as genetic extinction was faced by the community by 1895, 6 years after the horrific double wedding. So severely disabled were the surviving children that they couldn't care for themselves, and the few adults capable of reproduction were themselves the products of such extreme inbreeding that pregnancy had become nearly impossible. A woman who had witnessed the complete destruction of her family through systematic inbreeding is revealed in Mary Ellen's final diary entries, written in 1894. With clinical precision, she documented the deaths of her remaining relatives, noting that her cousin husband Samuel had died during a seizure and that her half-brothers succumbed to mysterious illnesses that caused their organs to shut down one by one. "We have bred ourselves into monsters, and now the monsters are dying," she wrote. Perhaps this is God's mercy. In 1896 occurred the last recorded birth in the Blackwood community when the final surviving woman gave birth to a child so severely deformed that it survived only hours. So extreme were the genetic abnormalities described by contemporary medical records, discovered decades later, that doctors couldn't classify them using existing medical knowledge. The effective end of the Blackwood bloodline's ability to reproduce was marked by the child's death. Alone and abandoned by the few surviving members of his community who had enough mental capacity to understand what he had done to them, Ezekiel himself died in 1897. A man who had finally realized the magnitude of his crime was shown by his final writings, found clutched in his hands. "I believed I was preserving God's chosen people," he wrote. "Instead, I have created hell on earth and damned my own blood to extinction." Among the last to die was Mary Ellen, succumbing in 1903 to what medical records describe as failure to thrive, a condition we now understand as the body's response to extreme psychological trauma. In the ruins of the old church where she had been forced to marry her cousin while watching her mother marry his father, she was found. A letter addressed to the outside world was in her hand, begging anyone who found it to tell the truth about what we did to ourselves so that no family ever makes the same mistake. Empty except for a forgotten cemetery where crooked headstones mark the graves of America's most inbred family is the Blackwood Valley today. That over 200 people died as a direct result of the systematic inbreeding program that began with Jeremiah's twisted vision of racial purity is estimated by local historians as perhaps the most disturbing example of what happens when isolation, religious extremism, and genetic ignorance combine to create a human breeding experiment that treated women as livestock and children as crops to be harvested, stands the story of Mary Ellen Blackwood and her mother's shared wedding day. That the darkest chapters of American history aren't always found in textbooks is a reminder. Sometimes they're buried in forgotten valleys where families destroyed themselves in pursuit of an impossible dream of genetic perfection.